the forgotten method that made farm trucks start with half a battery. On a January morning in 1954, when the thermometer outside the kitchen window read 8 degrees below zero, Robert Hendricks stood in his barn staring at his International Harvester pickup truck with a problem that thousands of American farmers knew all too well. The battery was half dead, the engine was cold as stone, and he had exactly 2 hours to get 20 miles down frozen roads to pick up feed before the supplier closed for the weekend. His livestock depended on that feed, and the nearest town with another supplier was 60 miles in the opposite direction. This wasn't just Robert's problem. Across the Great Plains, through the Midwest and up into the northern states, farmers faced this exact situation every winter. Batteries back then weren't the reliable powerhouses we know today. A battery that tested strong in October might barely turn an engine over by February. Cold weather reduced battery capacity dramatically, sometimes by 50% or more, and most farm trucks sat outside in the elements because barn space was reserved for livestock and equipment that couldn't withstand the weather at all. The automotive industry of that era hadn't yet solved the cold weather starting problem. Battery technology was advancing, but slowly. Most farm batteries were 6-volt systems, and even the newer 12-volt batteries that started appearing in the early 50s struggled in extreme cold. Factory recommendations suggested keeping batteries warm, but that advice meant nothing to a farmer whose truck sat in an open yard 200 feet from the house. Robert had owned this truck for 3 years, and he'd learned its temperament the way a horseman learns his mount. The previous owner had warned him about winter starts, and Robert had developed a collection of tricks over time. He'd tried parking the truck facing south to catch whatever weak winter sun might help. He'd tried draining the oil at night and warming it on the stove before pouring it back in at dawn, a technique that worked but consumed an hour of precious morning time. He'd tried the old-timers method of pulling the spark plugs and pouring a capful of gasoline directly into each cylinder, which sometimes worked and sometimes flooded the engine into uselessness. But on this particular morning, standing in the barn with his breath forming clouds in the frigid air, Robert remembered something his father-in-law had mentioned the previous winter. The old man, who'd farmed through the Depression and possessed a lifetime of accumulated knowledge about making do with what you had described a method he'd learned from a mechanic in Omaha back in the late 30s. Robert had filed the information away as interesting but unnecessary. Now, with a half-dead battery and a truck that absolutely had to start, that conversation came back to him with sudden clarity. The method his father-in-law described involved using the truck's generator as a motor to spin the engine. It sounded backwards, almost impossible, because everyone knew that generators produced electricity when the engine turned them, not the other way around. But the old man had insisted it worked, had explained the theory behind it, and had described watching the Omaha mechanic demonstrate it on a dead truck that started on the first try. The principle, as Robert understood it, was straightforward in theory, but required some mechanical confidence to attempt. Every generator in those trucks was essentially an electric motor running in reverse. When the engine turned, the generator's armature spun inside its magnetic field, producing current that charged the battery. But if you fed current into that same generator from an external source, the magnetic forces would reverse and the armature would spin as a motor. And since the generator was belt connected to the engine's crankshaft, if you could make the generator spin with enough force, it would turn the engine. The challenge was finding an external power source strong enough to spin a generator with enough torque to overcome a cold engine's resistance. This is where the method got creative, and where thousands of farmers who learned it found themselves improvising with whatever they had available. The most common solution involved a second battery, ideally a fresh one. But even a half-depleted battery from another vehicle could work, if you connected it correctly. Robert's situation that morning was actually more common than most people realized. Rural electrification had reached most American farms by the 50s, but that didn't mean every farmer could afford multiple batteries or easy access to battery chargers. Money was tight for most farming families, especially in winter when income stopped, but expenses continued. A new battery cost real money, the kind of money you thought twice about spending. So farmers developed a network of mutual assistance, borrowing and lending batteries the way they borrowed and shared equipment. Robert walked to his father-in-law's place, a quarter-mile down the road, and explained his situation. The old man's eyes lit up with recognition. He disappeared into his own barn and emerged with a good battery from his farm-old tractor, which he wouldn't need until spring planting anyway. Together they carried it back to Robert's barn, the old man talking the whole way about the time he'd seen this method save a harvest crew whose truck had died 20 miles from the nearest town. The setup required careful attention to polarity and connections because reversing current flow through a generator meant understanding which terminals did what. Farm trucks of that era had their generators mounted prominently on the engine block, usually on the passenger side with visible belt connections to the crankshaft pulley. The generator had three main terminals: the armature terminal where current normally flowed out to the voltage regulator, the field terminal that controlled the magnetic field strength, and a ground connection to the generator housing. Robert positioned the borrowed battery on his workbench and gathered his tools. He needed jumper cables, which most farmers kept on hand, for the more conventional method of jump-starting from another running vehicle. He needed his wrench set to disconnect certain wires from the generator, and he needed a clear understanding of what he was about to do, because feeding electricity into a generator the wrong way could damage the system, or at minimum, blow a fuse and leave him worse off than when he started. The first step involved disconnecting the generator from the truck's electrical system to prevent feedback into the battery or voltage regulator. Robert loosened the nut on the armature terminal and carefully removed the wire that normally carried charging current back toward the battery. This wire, usually marked or identifiable by its routing, was the main output from the generator. With this disconnected, the generator became an isolated unit, still mechanically connected to the engine through its belt, but electrically separate from the truck's system. Next came the critical connections. Robert took his jumper cables and attached the positive clamp to the generator's armature terminal, the same terminal he'd just disconnected from the truck's system. This would feed positive current directly into the generator's armature. The negative clamp went to a solid ground point on the engine block, completing the circuit. The other end of the jumper cables connected to the borrowed battery, positive to positive, negative to negative. His father-in-law watched the setup carefully, nodding approval. The old man explained that some mechanics also connected current to the field terminal to strengthen the magnetic field, but he'd found that unnecessary for most applications. The armature connection alone provided enough power to spin the generator as a motor, and keeping the setup simple reduced the chances of making a mistake. With everything connected, Robert paused to double-check his work. The borrowed battery was fresh and fully charged, which meant it could deliver substantial current. The jumper cables were heavy gauge, capable of carrying high amperage without excessive voltage drop. The generator was mechanically sound, its belt tight and properly aligned with the crankshaft pulley. The truck's transmission was in neutral, and the parking brake was set firmly. Robert's father-in-law offered one more piece of advice: prime the engine first. Even with the generator spinning the motor, a bone-dry carburetor would prevent ignition. So Robert worked the hand primer on his fuel pump, a lever that mechanically pushed gasoline into the carburetor bowl. He pumped it 20 times, counting each stroke, until he felt resistance indicating the bowl was full. Then he pulled the choke knob all the way out, enriching the fuel mixture for cold starting. The moment of truth arrived, with less drama than Robert expected. When he touched the positive jumper cable clamp to the borrowed battery terminal, the generator immediately began spinning with a low whirring sound. The belt transmitted that rotation to the crankshaft pulley, and the engine began turning. It wasn't fast, maybe 60 or 70 revolutions per minute, but it was steady and mechanical, like watching a giant clock mechanism in motion. The pistons rose and fell in their cylinders. The camshaft rotated, opening and closing valves in sequence. The distributor rotor spun, sending timed sparks to each spark plug, and after 3 full revolutions of the crankshaft, the engine coughed. Robert immediately switched on the truck's ignition, and on the next compression stroke, the engine caught with a rough idle that quickly smoothed out as fuel flow stabilized and cylinders warmed. He kept the jumper cables connected for another 10 seconds while the engine found its rhythm, then disconnected them quickly. The generator, now being spun by the running engine instead of spinning the engine itself, immediately resumed its normal function as a current producer. Robert reconnected the armature wire to the generator terminal, restoring the truck's electrical system to standard operation. The whole process from setup to running engine had taken less than 3 minutes. His father-in-law grinned with satisfaction, the expression of a man who just watched an old truth prove itself once again. They loaded the borrowed battery back into the old man's truck, and Robert drove his own truck out of the barn into the winter morning, arriving at the feed supplier with 40 minutes to spare. But this story isn't really about one farmer on one cold morning. It's about a technique that spread through American farming communities like wildfire in an era when mechanical knowledge meant survival. The generator motor method, as it came to be called, represented something fundamental about rural American culture during the middle decades of the 20th century, the absolute necessity of understanding how your equipment actually worked, not just how to operate it. In towns and cities, people could afford to treat vehicles as black boxes. When something failed, you called a mechanic or had the vehicle towed to a garage. But farmers operated on different terms entirely. The nearest mechanic might be 20 miles away, and 20 miles in winter weather with a dead truck meant a whole day lost. Plus, there was the simple economic reality that service calls cost money, and farmers were fundamentally people who solved their own problems whenever possible. So mechanical knowledge spread through farming communities in patterns that predated formal education systems. Old-timers taught younger farmers, neighbors helped neighbors, and shared techniques during the process. Feed store conversations and grain elevator waiting rooms served as informal classrooms where men discussed solutions to common problems. And when someone discovered a method that worked, that knowledge propagated through the community with remarkable speed. The generator motor technique spread this way throughout the 50s and into the 60s. A farmer in Iowa would learn it from a mechanic, use it successfully, and mention it to his neighbor. That neighbor would try it on his own truck, find that it worked, and share the technique at a Farm Bureau meeting. Someone at that meeting would remember it when visiting family in Nebraska, and suddenly farmers 3 states away were using the same method. Documentation of this technique appears in several agricultural extension publications from the period, though not always under the same name. Some sources called it the generator reverse method. Others referred to it as emergency generator starting. A few practical mechanics manuals from the late 50s include diagrams showing the proper connections, usually in sections devoted to cold weather operation or emergency procedures. What made the technique particularly valuable was its versatility. While the most common application involved using a second battery to power the generator, farmers adapted the core principle to whatever power sources they had available. Some used battery chargers plugged into barn outlets, though this required a charger capable of delivering enough amperage to spin the generator under load. Others connected their farm tractors' electrical systems, running cables from the tractor battery to the truck's generator. One innovative farmer in Wisconsin, whose story appeared in a rural newspaper from 1957, rigged a permanent setup in his barn using a bank of 3 6-volt batteries wired in series to produce 18 volts. He kept these batteries on a trickle charger all winter, and whenever a vehicle needed starting, he simply connected his heavy-duty cables to the generator. The higher voltage spun the generator faster, which turned the engine more quickly, improving the chances of ignition in extreme cold. The technique also revealed something about the mechanical similarities across different manufacturers' vehicles. While Ford, Chevrolet, International, Dodge, and other truck makers each had their proprietary designs, the fundamental generator architecture remained surprisingly consistent. They all used the same basic principle of electromagnetic induction, which meant the generator motor method worked regardless of brand. A farmer who learned the technique on his International harvester could apply the same knowledge to his neighbor's Ford. This mechanical commonality existed because the generator design itself predated most of these truck manufacturers. The basic generator architecture had been established in the earliest days of automotive electrical systems, and while refinements occurred over decades, the core components and operating principles remained stable. This meant that knowledge about generators, unlike knowledge about specific engine designs or transmission types, transferred easily across vehicle types. The method had limitations, of course, and experienced farmers learned to recognize when it would work and when it wouldn't. If an engine's oil had thickened to the consistency of cold molasses, even a spinning generator couldn't overcome the resistance. If the ignition system was faulty or spark plugs were fouled, spinning the engine accomplished nothing. And if the generator itself was worn out or damaged, the whole technique failed before it started. But within its operational envelope, the generator motor method proved remarkably reliable. It worked best on engines that were mechanically sound, but simply lacked the battery power for conventional starting. It worked on cold but not frozen engines, where oil still had enough fluidity to allow rotation. It worked when the electrical system was intact, but the battery was depleted. Exactly the situation thousands of farmers found themselves in every winter. The technique's popularity peaked during the late 50s and early 60s, a period when farm mechanization was well established, but battery technology still lagged behind vehicle demands. This was also the era when many rural families owned multiple vehicles, but couldn't afford to maintain multiple batteries in top condition. A farm might have a truck for hauling, a car for town trips, and a tractor for field work, but only one or two good batteries among them. The generator motor method allowed these families to keep everything running despite limited resources. As the 60s progressed, several technological developments began to reduce the need for such emergency starting methods. Battery technology improved significantly with better plate designs and more efficient chemical formulations. 12-volt systems became universal, providing more cranking power. Synthetic oils that flowed better in cold weather reduced engine resistance. And electric block heaters, which could be plugged in overnight to keep engines warm, became standard equipment in northern states. But even as these improvements appeared, the generator motor method retained value as emergency knowledge. Modern conveniences could fail. A block heater was useless during a power outage. An expensive new battery could still discharge if someone left lights on overnight. And farm equipment had a way of surviving long past its expected lifespan, which meant generators and starters that should have been replaced years ago were still being pressed into service. The method also illustrated a broader principle about appropriate technology for agricultural applications. Farms required solutions that were simple, robust and implementable with commonly available tools and materials. A starting technique that required specialized equipment or professional service was useless to a farmer who needed his truck running immediately, but a technique that used simple jumper cables and a borrowed battery perfectly matched the reality of farm life. This principle of appropriate technology extended far beyond starting methods. Farmers of this era evaluated every tool, every technique, every piece of equipment through the lens of practical implementation. Could they maintain it themselves? Could they repair it with available parts? Could they afford it on farm income? Could they teach it to their sons and hired hands? These questions shaped agricultural practice in ways that urban Americans rarely understood. The generator motor method answered yes to all these questions. It required no special tools beyond jumper cables that most farmers already owned. It used no exotic parts or materials. It cost nothing beyond the time to make the connections. And it could be taught in a 10-minute demonstration, after which anyone with basic mechanical sense could replicate it. Knowledge like this represented a form of capital that farmers accumulated over lifetimes. A young man starting his farming career might struggle with cold weather starts, trying conventional methods that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. But an experienced farmer, someone who'd weathered 30 or 40 winters, possessed dozens of techniques for every common problem. This knowledge made the difference between success and failure, between getting crops planted on time and missing the optimal window, between keeping livestock fed and watching them suffer. The social dynamics of knowledge sharing in farming communities deserves attention because it operated differently than information transfer in other contexts. Farmers were simultaneously independent businessmen competing in the same markets and neighbors who depended on each other for survival. This created a culture where hoarding knowledge was considered poor form, but actively seeking help too frequently marked you as incompetent. The balance worked through informal networks of reciprocal assistance. If your neighbor taught you the generator motor method when your truck wouldn't start, you were expected to share different knowledge when he faced a problem you'd solved. Maybe you'd figured out how to keep mice from nesting in stored machinery over winter. Maybe you knew a trick for sharpening plowshares that extended their life. The exchange wasn't transactional or immediate, but over years and decades, these knowledge transfers created community bonds that went deeper than mere neighborliness. Regional variations in the generator motor technique developed based on local conditions and available resources. In areas where farms had good electrical service, battery chargers became the preferred power source. In more remote regions where electricity was less reliable, the second battery method dominated. Some northern farmers kept dedicated starting batteries that they rotated through vehicles as needed, while southern farmers who rarely faced severe cold weather might go years without needing the technique at all. The method also intersected with another forgotten practice, battery maintenance as a regular farm chore. Modern sealed batteries require essentially no maintenance, but the batteries of the 50s and 60s needed regular attention. Water levels had to be checked and topped off with distilled water. Terminal connections needed cleaning to prevent corrosion. Specific gravity testing with a hydrometer indicated charge levels and cell health. Farmers who maintained their batteries properly experienced fewer starting problems, which meant they needed emergency techniques less frequently. But even the best-maintained battery could fail unexpectedly, and winter weather affected all batteries regardless of condition. So the generator motor method served as insurance, a technique you hoped you'd never need, but were grateful to know when circumstances demanded it. The decline of this technique in the 70s and 80s reflected broader changes in American agriculture. Farms grew larger and more specialized, which meant more capital investment in equipment. Maintenance shifted from on-farm repairs to dealer service departments. Vehicles became more complex, with electronic ignition systems and eventually computer-controlled engines that made simple mechanical interventions less feasible. But perhaps more significantly, the generation of farmers who'd learned these techniques during the Depression and World War II years began retiring. Their sons and grandsons, who'd grown up with improved technology and greater access to commercial services, never developed the same depth of mechanical knowledge. This wasn't failure or laziness, it was simply that the circumstances requiring such knowledge occurred less frequently. Yet the generator motor method never completely disappeared. Even today, in rural areas where farmers still operate older equipment, this knowledge persists. Old-timers teach it to young mechanics who are curious about how things worked before modern electronics. Classic vehicle enthusiasts learn it as part of maintaining vintage trucks, and in developing countries where vehicle technology mirrors what rural America used in the 50s, these same techniques are being discovered and applied as practical solutions to contemporary problems. The lasting significance of the generator motor method extends beyond its practical utility. It represents a way of thinking about technology that prioritized understanding over consumption. When Robert Hendricks stood in his barn that January morning, he didn't see his truck as a disposable commodity to be replaced when it failed. He saw it as a complex machine whose components could be manipulated and reconfigured to solve problems. The generator wasn't just a generator, it was also a potential motor. The battery wasn't just a power source, it was stored energy that could be redirected through different circuits to achieve different ends. This perspective, this fundamental understanding that machines were assemblages of systems that could be understood and modified, characterized rural American culture during the middle 20th century. It was knowledge born of necessity, refined through practice, and shared through community networks that preceded and paralleled formal educational institutions. The method also illustrates how technological progress isn't always linear or absolute. Yes, modern batteries are more reliable. Yes, contemporary starting systems work better in cold weather. But that progress came at the cost of simplicity and owner serviceability. A farmer today facing a dead battery in his modern truck has fewer options than Robert Hendricks had in 1954. The electronic systems that make contemporary vehicles more reliable also make them more dependent on functioning perfectly. There's no clever workaround, no way to trick the system into operation through understanding and improvisation. Whether this trade-off represents progress or loss depends on perspective. For most people, the convenience and reliability of modern vehicles far outweigh the loss of personal agency in repairs. But for those who value self-sufficiency and mechanical understanding, Something genuine was lost when vehicles became too complex for owner intervention. The generator motor method survives now primarily as historical knowledge, documented in old manuals and remembered by aging farmers who used it when circumstances required. It's the kind of practical wisdom that rarely makes it into official histories of technology or agriculture. Yet it shaped daily life for thousands of families across rural America. It represents a problem-solving approach that valued understanding over specialization, improvisation over consumption, and community knowledge over commercial services. Thank you for watching this video about a forgotten piece of American agricultural wisdom. If you found this story interesting and want to learn about more traditional farming knowledge and rural American culture, please subscribe to our channel, give this video a like, and share it with anyone who appreciates practical history. These stories preserve a way of life and a depth of knowledge that's rapidly disappearing from American culture. This video is inspired by real historical facts and events. It is not intended to represent or offend any specific individuals or groups. The character of Robert Hendricks is a representative figure who reflects the genuine experiences of hundreds of American farmers who faced similar situations during this era. The generator motor starting method described here was a real technique used throughout rural America from the 1930s through the 1970s, documented in agricultural extension publications and mechanical manuals of the period.